Hi there, welcome to our last topic in this chapter on cells and organ systems. Our last thing I want to look at is comparing different organisms from really tiny or unicellular to much larger, more complicated multicellular. And what's the pros and cons and some examples of these types of organisms. Let's review what an organism means. What does it really mean to be a living thing? Well, to be living, it must, of course, be able to grow, take in matter and materials, release energy, release waste, respond to stimuli, and reproduce. Let's look at a quick video clip about these important topics that we studied earlier on in the first part of this unit.
Matter can be divided into living and non-living. Living things are called organisms. Organisms are made of cells. There are certain characteristics of living cells that distinguish them from non-living matter. Living organisms eat food so that they can get energy for metabolic processes in the body, to increase in size and weight, as well as to reproduce or have babies. Living organisms excrete waste. They also need oxygen to live and release carbon dioxide as waste. Living organisms respond and react to stimuli in the environment. The stimuli causes them to change their behavior. All living things have certain characteristics that make them different from non-living matter.
And so let's go back to the PowerPoint then. So here's a level of organization we've discussed before. So there are atoms, molecules, we discussed cells. Groups of cells form tissues, groups of tissues form an organ, groups of organs form the different organ systems, and then groups of organ systems could form an organism. And here is an example of how that works, and we discussed this in this chapter. So what are organisms made of? Well, we know this already. Organisms can be made of one single cell, or they can be made of multiple or many cells. Most single-celled organisms are found in two different groups. One is the bacteria, which are Monera, and some are in the group called Protista. Most multicellular organisms are found in the fungi, plant, and animal kingdom. So let's talk about single-celled organisms. They're usually tiny and microscopic. One cell may have a nucleus or chloroplast and can be made in three types. They could be single-cell plants, animal-like, or bacteria. They could reproduce asexually, that means without a mate, or sexually, which means they need a mate. And they could live by themselves or in colonies, which means in groups. And some move and some do not. So here are some examples of single-celled organisms. Plant-like euglena and diatoms, which our book has two pictures of. Diatoms tend to live in colonies, whereas euglena tends to live by itself. And they're plant-like because, as you can see here, they're green and photosynthesize with the help of chloroplasts. Here's some animal-like. Ciliates come in many categories. This is a paramecium, but amoeba, which is what this one is, an amoeba like a blob, is also an animal-like. Now these are a little more complex because, as you can see, they have a few organelles that indicate they're very similar to our cells. And then, of course, there are bacteria-like. Multicelled organisms are more complicated and they come in three types: plants, animals, and fungi. As you know, they reproduce sexually or asexually, and just like single-celled organisms, they can be alone or in groups. So here are some examples: plants, trees, ferns, animals, and insects, or humans and insects, mushrooms, and slime molds. Before we go any further, it's important to note the distinction between these two cells, and it's actually believed by some scientists that we evolved from this group. There are some single-celled organisms, mostly bacteria-like, which are prokaryotic cells. That means without or before nucleus. So if you look here, this is a prokaryotic cell, and the genetic information is just sitting inside the cytoplasm. There is no nuclear membrane, and it just floats around, making them less sophisticated as a consequence. Whereas eukaryotic cells, like our cells, have a nucleus with a nuclear membrane that helps act more as a complicated brain of the organism. So, prokaryotic versus eukaryotic. Let's compare and contrast. Single-celled organisms made of one cell, they're unicellular. They can get food from other organisms or make their own food. They can reproduce asexually or sexually, and they live alone or in colonies. Some move and some don't. What about multicellular organisms? Well, just as a review, one big difference, they're many-celled. They can get food or make their own. They can reproduce asexually or sexually. They can live in colonies or alone. And they can move or not. So not a huge contrast between the two, except the first one in red. But when it comes to prokaryotes, which have a cell with their genetic information just floating in the cytoplasm with no nucleus, versus eukaryotes, which have a nucleus, they're simple, easy to grow, they have fast reproduction, and they're pretty much all the same. Whereas eukaryotes can specialize, can contain many cells, and can build larger bodies. So eukaryotic cells can be multicellular, and the cells can specialize like blood cells, muscle cells, so that cells can make tissue and tissues can make organs. Here's a bacteria. As you can see, if we said, is it prokaryote or eukaryote? It's definitely a prokaryote because the DNA is floating in the cytoplasm. Here's some plant protists. Protists are single-celled. Is it prokaryote or eukaryote, this euglena? Well, it's eukaryote because it's got a nucleus. Diatoms, we looked at them before. Here are some animal protists. Amoeba, and paramecium, both are eukaryote. And fungi have one unicellular organism in them, and that's yeast. They're eukaryotic though, but most of the fungi are larger, and this is an example. Mushroom are fungi, and they can be harmful or helpful. So that's a quick review of how single-celled organisms and multicellular organisms compare and contrast. As well, you should know some examples.